The marble floors of Westbrook Preparatory gleamed under crystal chandeliers, reflecting the polished shoes of students whose trust funds exceeded most people's lifetime earnings. But in the basement janitor's closet, 17-year-old Zara Williams knelt on cold concrete, scrubbing toilets with her bare hands while 3 girls stood over her, laughing. What those bullies didn't know was that Zara had been documenting everything. And what happened next would bring down the most prestigious private school in Connecticut. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Westbrook Preparatory Academy stood like a fortress of privilege against the rolling hills of Fairfield County, Connecticut. Its Gothic Revival architecture spoke of centuries-old traditions. Though the school had only been founded in 1952 by railroad magnate Augustus Westbrook III, the towering stone walls were draped in ivy that had been carefully cultivated to look ancient, and the manicured grounds stretched across 120 acres of what had once been a tobacco plantation. The morning fog rolled across the lacrosse fields as Mercedes-Benz SUVs and Tesla Model S sedans formed a procession through the wrought iron gates. Parents in their designer clothing and expensive watches dropped off children who wore their entitlement like designer labels. These weren't just wealthy families. They were dynasties. The Hartwell family had produced 3 Supreme Court justices. The Blackwood name adorned hospital wings from Boston to Miami. The Ashford fortune had been built on oil, then tech, then cryptocurrency, adapting with each generation to maintain their stranglehold on American capitalism. Inside the schools, mahogany-paneled halls, portraits of distinguished alumni gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to judge everyone who passed beneath them. Senator Richard Caldwell, class of '78, tech mogul Patricia Sinclair, class of '85, federal judge Marcus Pemberton, class of '92. These weren't just successful graduates. They were the architects of modern American power, and their children now walked these same halls with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the game is rigged in their favor. The faculty lounge reeked of expensive coffee and quiet corruption. Teachers who had once held idealistic notions about education now found themselves trapped in a system where grades could be negotiated like stock prices. Professor Eleanor Hutchins, who taught advanced placement English, had watched her enthusiasm for literature slowly drain away as she learned that challenging a Westbrook or questioning a Hartwell meant finding herself unemployed by Christmas. The unspoken rule was simple. These children were not students to be educated, but products to be polished and sent on to their predetermined destinies at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. The academic standards at Westbrook were supposedly rigorous, but like everything else about the institution, they bent to accommodate the right last names. Plagiarism became collaborative learning when committed by a senator's daughter. Cheating transformed into resourcefulness when the culprit's father sat on the board of trustees. The SAT prep courses weren't just about test-taking strategies. They were about maintaining the illusion that these children had earned their perfect scores through merit rather than through private tutors, who cost more per hour than most families made in a week. The social hierarchy at Westbrook was as rigid as any caste system. At the top sat the legacy families, those whose ancestors had attended the school and whose names graced buildings and scholarship funds. Below them were the new money families, tech entrepreneurs, and hedge fund managers who had bought their way into respectability but would always be seen as slightly vulgar by the old guard. Further down were the diplomatic families, children of ambassadors and foreign ministers who brought international prestige, but lacked the generational American wealth that truly mattered. And at the very bottom, almost invisible in their isolation, were the scholarship students. There were only 12 of them in a student body of 400, carefully selected not just for their academic excellence, but for their ability to enhance the school's diversity statistics without challenging its fundamental power structure. They were living proof that Westbrook was a meritocracy, at least in the glossy brochures sent to potential donors. The dining hall operated like a microcosm of American society, with invisible barriers as real as prison walls. The center tables were reserved for the legacy families, their conversations revolving around vacation homes in the Hamptons and ski trips to Aspen. The corner booths housed the new money kids, desperate to prove they belonged despite their fathers. Working-class origins. The scholarship students sat at a table near the kitchen, close enough to smell the industrial dishwashers and hear the clatter of plates being scraped clean by the cafeteria workers, who looked suspiciously like their own parents. Even the architecture reinforced these divisions. The main academic buildings, with their soaring ceilings and stained glass windows, housed classes in literature, history, and philosophy subjects deemed worthy of the elite. The practical courses, vocational training that might actually prove useful in the real world, were relegated to newer, cheaper buildings on the outskirts of campus. The message was clear. Thinking was for the wealthy. Working was for everyone else. The school's disciplinary system functioned as a masterclass in how justice bends to power. When Bradley Ashford was caught selling Adderall to underclassmen, it became a medical misunderstanding that required only a brief meeting with the school counselor. When scholarship student Marcus Chen was found with the same pills, it became a drug offense that nearly cost him his place at the school. The difference wasn't just in punishment, but in perception. Bradley was seen as a future leader making a youthful mistake, while Marcus was viewed as a potential criminal who had somehow slipped through the admissions process. The teachers themselves had been sorted into their own hierarchy. The senior faculty, those who had been at Westbrook for decades, had learned to read the subtle signals that determined how strictly they should grade certain students. A raised eyebrow from Headmaster Whitmore could mean the difference between a C+ and a B for a struggling legacy student. A phone call from a concerned parent could transform a failing grade into a passing one, accompanied by a sudden improvement in class participation scores that were impossible to verify or challenge. Technology at Westbrook was cutting edge, but only for those who already had access to everything else. The library's rare book collection was worth millions, housed in climate-controlled cases that were opened only for special occasions. Meanwhile, the scholarship students made do with outdated textbooks and laptops that crashed whenever too many programs ran simultaneously. The school's Wi-Fi network had two tiers: Westbrook Elite for the children of major donors, and Westbrook General for everyone else, with bandwidth that reflected the user's place in the school's social ecosystem. The guidance counselors operated more like personal assistants to privilege than actual educators. Their job wasn't to help students discover their passions or develop their potential. It was to ensure that the right students ended up at the right colleges, maintaining the networks that kept power circulating among the same families generation after generation. College recommendation letters were works of fiction, transforming mediocre students into future leaders through the alchemy of carefully chosen words and strategic omissions. Even the school's charitable initiatives reinforced the existing power structure. The annual food drive was organized by the same students who complained about having to eat cafeteria food when their private chefs weren't available. The tutoring program paired wealthy students with struggling scholarship kids, creating a dynamic where the privileged played savior to the desperate. These activities looked good on college applications and provided material for admissions essays about overcoming adversity. Though the adversity being overcome was usually someone else's, the maintenance staff at Westbrook moved through the halls like ghosts, cleaning and repairing in the early morning hours before the students arrived. They were almost exclusively people of color, immigrants whose broken English made them easy to ignore and exploit. Their children attended the public schools that Westbrook families actively defunded through their political contributions, ensuring that the gap between the elite and everyone else continued to widen with each passing generation. As autumn settled over the Connecticut hills, painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson that would have looked perfect in a boarding school. Brochure, the machine of privilege, continued its relentless operation. Students prepared for standardized tests they didn't need to worry about passing, wrote essays about hardships they had never experienced, and received awards for achievements that had been purchased rather than earned. But somewhere in this carefully constructed paradise, cracks were beginning to show. Not everyone was willing to play by rules designed to keep them powerless. Not everyone accepted that their place in the hierarchy was fixed and immutable. And sometimes, just sometimes, the system's own tools could be turned against it by someone smart enough to understand how the game was really played. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the rot beneath Westbrook's polished surface, though none of the players yet understood their roles in the drama about to unfold. Zara Williams had memorized every crack in the sidewalk between the bus stop and Westbrook's imposing gates. While her classmates arrived in vehicles that cost more than her family's annual income, she walked the final quarter mile each morning, her worn backpack heavy with textbooks she couldn't afford to replace. The security guards knew her routine. By now, barely glancing up from their newspapers as she presented her student ID, the plastic already showing signs of wear after just 2 months at the academy, her scholarship had been earned through a combination of academic excellence and what the admissions committee called exceptional circumstances. Those circumstances included working 20 hours a week at her aunt's hair salon in Bridgeport while maintaining a 4.0 GPA at her public high school, where textbooks were shared between classes and the computer lab consisted of 12 machines. From 2015, the scholarship covered tuition, but everything else, uniforms, books, supplies, even the mandatory school events, came out of her family's stretched budget. Zara's mother, Denise, worked double shifts as a certified nursing assistant at 2 different hospitals, her hands permanently stained from industrial disinfectant and her back aching from lifting patients twice her size. Her father had died in Afghanistan when Zara was 12, leaving behind a flag, some medals, and a family struggling to stay afloat on widow's benefits and whatever Denise could earn. The scholarship to Westbrook wasn't just an opportunity. It was a lifeline, a chance to break the cycle that had trapped generations of Williams women in service, jobs, and economic uncertainty. But earning the scholarship had been easier than surviving it. The uniform alone had cost $300, and that was for the discount version available to scholarship students. Zara had watched her mother count and recount the bills before handing them over to the school's business office, each $20 note representing hours of backbreaking work. The required laptop was another month's worth of groceries, and the supplemental reading list included books that cost $40 each, books that most students already owned from their private tutors and summer enrichment programs. The academic workload at Westbrook was unlike anything Zara had experienced. Her public school had prepared her well in some areas. She could write better than most of her classmates and had a work ethic that put their casual effort to shame. But she was years behind in others. While her peers had been taking Mandarin since elementary school, she was struggling with basic conversational phrases. Their summer internships at their parents' companies had given them insights into business and law that she couldn't hope to match. They referenced experiences, museum exhibitions, Broadway shows, European vacations that existed outside her frame of reference entirely. Language arts was her strongest subject, but even there she felt the weight of cultural differences. When Professor Hutchins assigned A Great Gatsby, Zara was the only student who hadn't already read it twice. Her classmates discussed the symbolism with casual authority, drawing parallels to their own experiences with old money families and inherited wealth. When she offered her perspective on the novel's critique of the American dream, the silence that followed her comments felt heavy with condescension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's an interesting interpretation," Professor Hutchins had said, her voice carrying the subtle dismissal that Zara was learning to recognize. Though I think Fitzgerald's intent was more nuanced than that. The class had moved on, but Zara had spent the rest of the period wondering if her analysis was actually wrong, or if it was simply unwelcome. Mathematics presented different challenges. While her public school had prepared her adequately for algebra and geometry, Westbrook's advanced placement courses assumed familiarity with concepts she'd never encountered. Her classmates had been working with expensive graphing calculators since middle school. Zara was still borrowing one from the math department's limited supply of loaners. Tutorial sessions were available, but they conflicted with her work schedule at the hair salon, where she earned the money that helped keep her family's lights on. The social navigation was perhaps the most exhausting aspect of her daily experience. Westbrook students had been socialized into their roles since birth, speaking in code that referenced shared experiences and assumptions Zara couldn't access. When they complained about having to fly commercial instead of private, or having to use the family's second home in Martha's Vineyard instead of the main estate, Zara learned to keep her expression neutral. Her own family's version of vacation was a weekend at her grandmother's house in Hartford, and even that required careful budget planning. Lunchtime became a strategic exercise in invisibility. The cafeteria's social geography was as rigid as any military formation, with each table representing a different tier of the school's hierarchy. Zara had claimed a spot at the corner table where the other scholarship students gathered, but even within that group, divisions existed. Marcus Chun's parents owned a small restaurant chain, giving him a financial stability that Zara envied. Isabella Rodriguez's mother was a doctor who had immigrated from Mexico, and while they faced their own challenges with discrimination, they had never worried about keeping the electricity on. The technology gap was most apparent in the computer science courses that Zara had been excited to take. While her classmates had been coding since elementary school on high-end machines with the latest software, she was learning to program on a laptop that crashed whenever she tried to run multiple applications. Her internet connection at home was unreliable, making it impossible to complete assignments that required constant online access. She often stayed late at school to use the library's computers, catching the last bus home and arriving after her mother had already left for her night shift. Extracurricular activities presented another minefield. The debate team required travel to tournaments that cost money Zara didn't have. The Model United Nations Club assumed participants could afford professional clothing for their simulations. Even the community service opportunities were structured around the schedules and interests of wealthy students' charity galas that required formal wear, volunteer work at exclusive museums that happened during her work hours. Despite these challenges, Zara had found ways to excel. Her essays consistently earned the highest grades in her English classes. Her mathematical problem-solving skills impressed even the most demanding teachers, and her perspective on historical events brought fresh insights to classroom discussions. She had a talent for seeing patterns and connections that others missed, perhaps because her outsider status gave her a different vantage point on the dynamics playing out around her. Her most valuable skill, however, was one she had developed purely by necessity: observation. Growing up in a world where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could have serious consequences, Zara had learned to read people with forensic precision. She noticed the micro-expressions that revealed true feelings, the subtle shifts in tone that indicated hidden agendas, the body language that exposed lies and insecurities. At Westbrook, this ability served her well, helping her navigate conversations and avoid social landmines that could have destroyed her reputation. The teachers' attitudes toward her were complex and often contradictory. Some, like Miss Patricia Coleman in a P history, seemed genuinely invested in her success, offering extra help and encouragement that went beyond their professional obligations. Others, like Professor Jonathan Sterling in advanced chemistry, treated her with a polite distance that never quite crossed into warmth. A few, particularly Mr. Richard Pemberton in economics, seemed almost resentful of her presence, as if her success challenged their fundamental beliefs about merit and achievement. Zara had also discovered that information was a form of currency at Westbrook, and her invisible status gave her access to conversations and observations that others missed. She knew which students were cheating on exams, which teachers were having affairs, which families were struggling financially despite their public appearance of wealth. She knew about the grade changes, the test answers shared through encrypted apps, the recommendation letters purchased through donations to college endowment funds. More importantly, she had begun to document everything. Her phone contained screenshots of group chats where students shared homework answers, photos of graded exams left carelessly on desks, recordings of conversations where teachers discussed changing grades for special students. She told herself it was just insurance, a way to protect herself if anyone ever questioned her right to be at Westbrook. But deep down, she knew it might be something more significant. The isolation was the hardest part. While her classmates formed study groups and social circles based on shared experiences and family connections, Zara remained perpetually on the outside. She was smart enough to contribute meaningfully to any academic discussion, but her different background made true friendship nearly impossible. The other scholarship students understood her situation, but had their own survival strategies that didn't always align with hers. The wealthy students either ignored her completely or treated her with a patronizing kindness that felt worse than open hostility. After school, while her classmates went to tennis lessons or sate tutoring or therapy sessions, Zara took the bus to her aunt's salon in Bridgeport. The work was physical and demanding, sweeping hair, folding towels, sanitizing equipment, but it was also honest in a way that Westbrook never felt. The women who came to get their hair done talked about real problems: making rent, finding childcare, dealing with discrimination at work. Their struggles gave context to her own challenges and reminded her why academic success mattered so much. The contrast between her two worlds became more pronounced as the semester progressed. At Westbrook, problems were solved with money, connections, and influence. A poor grade became a donation to the scholarship fund. A disciplinary issue became a family connection to the board of trustees. A college rejection became a phone call from a senator or Supreme Court justice. In Bridgeport, problems were solved with hard work, creativity, and community support. People helped each other not because they expected favors in return, but because they understood that survival required solidarity. Zara had begun to realize that her true education at Westbrook wasn't happening in the classrooms. She was learning how power really worked in America, how the wealthy maintained their advantages across generations, how systems that appeared fair on the surface were designed to perpetuate inequality. This knowledge was valuable, but it was also dangerous. The more she understood about Westbrook's hidden mechanisms, the more she realized how vulnerable her position really was. As October arrived, and the first hints of winter began to creep into the Connecticut air, Zara had settled into her routine of careful navigation and quiet observation. She had learned to be invisible when necessary and indispensable when possible. She had mastered the art of academic excellence without social integration, of being present without belonging. She had become an expert at surviving in a world that was designed to exclude her. But survival, she was beginning to understand, might not be enough. The system that kept her on the margins was the same system that kept millions of others trapped in cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Her scholarship was presented as proof that Westbrook was a meritocracy, but she had seen enough to know that exceptions were used to justify rules, not to change them. The question that haunted her quiet moments was whether she would remain content to be the exception, or whether she would risk everything to challenge the rules themselves. That decision, she knew, would define not just her time at Westbrook, but the kind of person she would become. And as the days grew shorter and the pressure continued to mount, she sensed that the choice would be made for her sooner than she expected. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the maple trees outside Westbrook's windows had turned the color of dried blood. Zara was retrieving her chemistry textbook from her locker when she found the note taped inside the metal door. Written in pink glitter pen on expensive stationery, it read, "Some people need to remember their place. The help uses the service entrance." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakably feminine, the letters formed with the careful precision taught in exclusive penmanship classes. Zara crumpled the note and dropped it in the nearest trash can, but the message had been received. Someone was watching her closely enough to know her schedule, to access her locker, to send a warning that felt both personal and deliberate. She spent the rest of the day hyper-aware of every glance and whisper, wondering who among her classmates had escalated from passive exclusion to active hostility. The perpetrator revealed herself 3 days later. Madison Hartwell was everything. Westbrook Preparatory represented in human form, blonde hair that moved like silk in slow motion, a smile that could sell luxury cars, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from never experiencing consequences. Her grandfather had been Secretary of Defense under Reagan. Her father owned the largest private equity firm in Connecticut, and her mother sat on the boards of 4 different charitable foundations that somehow never seemed to help anyone who actually needed help. Madison's circle consisted of 2 other girls who functioned more like accessories than friends. Chelsea Blackwood, whose family fortune came from defense contracts and oil refineries, served as Madison's enforcer, the one who delivered messages and carried out orders with the efficiency of a corporate middle manager. Tiffany Ashford was the recorder, always ready with her phone to document whatever entertainment Madison provided, her family's tech money having purchased her a front-row seat to someone else's performance of power. The harassment began subtly, as these things always did among the wealthy. Zara would find her seat in the cafeteria inexplicably wet, forcing her to eat standing up or go hungry. Her locker combination would mysteriously stop working, requiring trips to the administration office that made her late for classes. Books would disappear from her backpack, only to reappear in the lost and found with pages mysteriously torn or coffee stains that rendered them unusable. Madison's weapon of choice was plausible deniability. When Zara's chemistry lab partner suddenly requested a switch, citing scheduling conflicts, Madison was there with a sympathetic smile and helpful suggestion about study groups that somehow never included scholarship students. When Zara's essay disappeared from the shared class folder, Madison was quick to offer her own notes, which turned out to be deliberately incomplete and filled with subtle errors that would have destroyed Zara's grade point average. The psychological warfare escalated. During the week before Halloween, Zara arrived at school to find her locker vandalized with the word "charity" written in permanent marker across the metal surface. The maintenance staff cleaned it off within hours, but not before half the student body had seen it during the morning rush. When she reported the incident to Vice Principal Henderson, he assured her it would be investigated thoroughly. But somehow the security cameras in that particular hallway had been experiencing technical difficulties for the past week. Madison's true genius lay in her ability to recruit others without explicitly asking for help. She would mention, seemingly casually, that scholarship students were taking spots away from more qualified applicants whose families had supported the school for generations. She would express concern about lowering standards to meet diversity quotas, always careful to frame her bigotry as concern for academic excellence. She painted herself as a defender of meritocracy while simultaneously benefiting from a system that had guaranteed her admission before she could even spell privilege. The social media campaign began in November. Photos of Zara eating alone, walking to the bus stop, or working at her aunt's salon began appearing on anonymous accounts with captions, Like scholarship girl knows her place, and some people should stick to what they're good at. The images were always taken from a distance, making it impossible to identify the photographer. But the timing and angles suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Zara's schedule and routines. Chelsea proved particularly adept at the physical aspects of harassment. She had mastered the art of the accidental collision, timing her movements perfectly to send Zara's books flying in the crowded hallways. Her apologies were always loud and public, performed with such theatrical sincerity that anyone watching would see only a clumsy girl making amends. But her eyes, in the moment of impact, always carried a message that was crystal clear. This was no accident. Tiffany's contribution was documentation and amplification. Every embarrassing moment, every small humiliation, was captured on her phone and shared through encrypted apps that the school's technology monitors couldn't access. She had a talent for timing, always ready to record when Zara stumbled or dropped something or failed to understand a cultural reference that everyone else took for granted. These videos never made it to public platforms, but they circulated among students like underground currency, building Madison's reputation as someone who could deliver entertainment without consequences. The teacher's complicity was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the campaign. Professor Sterling, who had always treated Zara with cool professionalism, began calling on her more frequently in class, but only when the questions were impossible to answer without context she couldn't have. Ms. Rodriguez in Spanish class started assigning presentations on topics that required expensive props or costumes, then expressing disappointment when Zara's projects looked less polished than her classmates. Even Ms. Coleman, who had been supportive, began offering help in ways that felt patronizing, as if Zara's academic success was somehow surprising given her background. The psychological pressure was carefully calibrated to avoid crossing lines that would trigger administrative intervention. Madison was too smart to use explicitly racial language or make direct threats. Instead, she relied on microaggressions, subtle exclusions, and social isolation techniques that were nearly impossible to prove or prosecute. When Zara tried to explain the situation to her mother, she found herself struggling to articulate exactly what was happening, because each individual incident seemed so minor when described in isolation. The breaking point came during the third week of November, when Madison escalated from psychological warfare to economic sabotage. Zara discovered that someone had been calling the hair salon where she worked, posing as a concerned parent and claiming that she had been stealing from students' lockers. The calls had been frequent enough and convincing enough that her aunt had begun to doubt her, questioning whether the job was worth the potential damage to the salon's reputation. That same week, Zara's scholarship status became the subject of what Madison called legitimate questions about financial aid allocation. She began circulating a petition requesting greater transparency in the scholarship selection process, carefully worded to sound like a call for fairness while actually demanding that recipients be subjected to additional scrutiny and oversight. The petition gained traction among students whose families had been rejected for financial aid despite their demonstrated need, a category that apparently included families with trust funds worth less than $50 million. The campaign reached its crescendo during the week before Thanksgiving break. Madison had discovered that Zara's mother worked as a nursing assistant and had begun making references to service industry families and their different values. In conversations that always seemed to happen within Zara's hearing, she started bringing up news stories about healthcare workers and their problems with professional boundaries, always with the kind of concerned tone that made her accusations sound like public safety warnings. The final straw was the fabricated incident report that appeared in Zara's permanent file. Someone had accused her of plagiarizing a history essay, providing evidence that consisted of similarities between her work and sources that were only available through expensive database subscriptions. The accusation was serious enough to trigger a formal review process, but vague enough that disproving it would require resources and time that Zara didn't have. Madison's fingerprints were nowhere on the complaint, but her satisfaction was visible every time they passed in the hallway. By the time December arrived, Zara was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to survive each day. She had lost weight from skipping meals to avoid the cafeteria, developed insomnia from the stress of never knowing what new humiliation awaited her, and begun to question whether the scholarship was worth the psychological toll it was extracting. Her grades remained perfect, but maintaining them required increasingly heroic efforts as the harassment consumed more of her mental and emotional energy. The isolation was complete. The other scholarship students had distanced themselves, either because they genuinely believed the rumors about her or because they couldn't afford to be associated with someone who had become a target. Her few allies among the faculty had been neutralized through careful manipulation and administrative pressure. Even her family relationships were strained, as her mother worried about the complaints from the salon and wondered whether her daughter was somehow bringing these problems on herself. Madison had achieved something remarkable. She had made Zara's continued presence at Westbrook feel like an act of aggression against the natural order. Every day that Zara showed up, every assignment she completed successfully, every moment she refused to disappear, became evidence of her unreasonable persistence in staying where she didn't belong. The message was clear and consistent. This was not her world, and her refusal to accept that fact was a form of defiance that would not be tolerated indefinitely. The trap was set with mathematical precision. Madison had isolated her target, neutralized potential allies, and created conditions where any response Zara might make could be portrayed as evidence of the attitude problems that scholarship students were known to develop. The only question remaining was what form the final confrontation would take, and Madison had already decided that it needed to be public, humiliating, and impossible to deny or explain away. As Thanksgiving break approached, and the other students prepared for family vacations in exotic locations, Zara found herself counting the days until she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of Westbrook, even temporarily. She didn't know that Madison was counting too, planning for the moment when they returned from break and the real lesson could finally begin. The lesson about power, about place, and about what happened to people who forgot their role in the natural hierarchy of things. The powder keg was primed, the fuse was lit, and everyone involved was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been underestimated by everyone else. The Monday after Thanksgiving break arrived with the kind of bitter December cold that turned breath into steam and made the marble floors of Westbrook Preparatory treacherous with condensation. Most students returned from their family vacations with fresh tans from Caribbean resorts or ski slopes in Aspen, their designer luggage filled with souvenirs that cost more than most families' monthly rent. Zara had spent the week working double shifts at her aunt's salon, earning money for Christmas gifts while trying to forget the humiliations of the previous month. Madison Hartwell had returned from her family's compound in Barbados with something more dangerous than a tan, a plan. She had spent the break refining her strategy, consulting with older siblings who had attended Westbrook and learning from their experiences about how to deliver maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. The goal was no longer just harassment. It was complete humiliation, the kind of public destruction that would force Zara to transfer schools and serve as a warning to any other scholarship students who might forget their place. The setup began during the third period, when Ms. Henderson announced over the intercom that the girls' bathroom on the second floor of the Humanities building would be closed for emergency cleaning due to a plumbing malfunction. The timing wasn't coincidental. Madison had spent the previous weekend researching the school's maintenance schedules and had discovered that the custodial staff took their lunch break between noon and 1 o'clock, leaving most of the building unsupervised during that crucial hour. The plumbing malfunction had been carefully orchestrated. Chelsea had volunteered to help with inventory in the maintenance closet during her free period, giving her access to the keys and supplies needed to create the perfect scene. A few strategically placed toilet paper rolls and some carefully applied cleaning chemicals would make any bathroom look like it needed immediate attention, especially to administrators who preferred not to investigate such matters too closely. Zara's presence in the building during lunch was guaranteed by her routine. While other students went off campus for meals at expensive restaurants or relaxed in the common areas with catered lunches from their family's personal chefs, Zara always spent her lunch period in the library, working on assignments and eating the sandwich she had packed at home. Madison had observed this pattern for weeks, noting the exact time when Zara would inevitably need to use the restroom before her afternoon classes at 12:15 p.m. As predicted, Zara made her way to the humanities building, her arms full of books. For her next class, the second-floor bathroom was indeed marked with an out-of-order sign, forcing her to walk to the basement level where the older, less frequently used facilities were located. This bathroom was perfect for Madison's purposes, isolated, poorly lit, and far enough from the main areas of the building that any sounds would be muffled by the building's thick walls and heavy doors. Madison, Chelsea, and Tiffany were already waiting when Zara pushed open the heavy door to the basement restroom. They had positioned themselves strategically, Madison blocking the exit, Chelsea guarding the window, and Tiffany holding her phone in recording position. The bathroom itself had been prepared like a stage set. Cleaning supplies were arranged. On the floor, rubber gloves lay beside industrial-strength toilet brushes, and the air reeked of disinfectant strong enough to make eyes water. "Well, well," Madison said, her voice carrying the kind of fake sweetness that made Zara's skin crawl. "Look who decided to join us for a little lesson in reality." Zara's hand tightened on her books, her mind immediately calculating distances and exit strategies. The basement bathroom had no other exits. The windows were too small and too high to provide escape, and the heavy door was now blocked by three girls who had clearly been planning this encounter for some time. "What do you want, Madison?" Zara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to flood her system. Chelsea stepped forward, her lacrosse player's build making her intentions clear. "We want you to understand something about your place here. See, there's been some confusion about your role at Westbrook." Tiffany giggled, the sound echoing off the tile walls like broken glass. "Some people think they're students here, but we know better, don't we?" Madison moved closer, her designer shoes clicking against the wet floor. "The thing is, Zara, you're not really one of us. You never were. You're here on charity, which makes you what's the word help, and help has certain responsibilities." She gestured toward the cleaning supplies with theatrical flair. "So we thought we'd give you some practice. You know, for when you inevitably drop out and go back to where you belong." Zara's eyes moved from face to face, reading the situation with the precision that had kept her safe in less privileged environments. These weren't just spoiled rich girls playing a prank. They were committed to this performance, invested in it in ways that made them genuinely dangerous. Madison's smile had the practiced cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions. Chelsea's posture suggested she was prepared for physical confrontation. Tiffany's phone was already recording, meaning this wasn't just about immediate humiliation, but long-term documentation. "You want me to clean toilets?" Zara said, not making it a question. "Bingo!" Madison clapped her hands together as if praising a particularly slow child. "See, you are smarter than you look. We want you to clean these toilets until they shine. On your hands and knees like the good little charity case you are. And Tiffany here is going to make sure we have a record of it for posterity." Chelsea picked up a toilet brush and held it out toward Zara. "Don't worry, we'll make sure everyone sees how good you are at this. Maybe we can get you a job recommendation for after you drop out." The moment stretched like a taut wire, filled with the kind of electric tension that precedes lightning strikes. Zara could feel her heart beating against her ribs, could hear the blood rushing in her ears, could taste the metallic flavor of adrenaline on her tongue. Every instinct told her to comply, to minimize the confrontation, to protect herself by giving them what they wanted. But another voice, deeper and stronger, reminded her of lessons learned in her father's memory and her mother's example. "No," Zara said quietly. Madison blinked, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me, I said no." Zara's voice was stronger now, carrying a weight that made the other girls shift uncomfortably. "I'm not cleaning your toilets. I'm not getting on my knees for you, and I'm not playing your game anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Madison's carefully constructed scenario hadn't included the possibility of refusal. She had planned for tears, for begging, for submission, but not for defiance from someone who was supposed to understand her powerlessness. "I don't think you understand," Madison said, her voice losing its theatrical sweetness and revealing the steel underneath. "This isn't a request. Chelsea, why don't you help our scholarship friend understand the situation better?" Chelsea moved forward with the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, her hands reaching for Zara's shoulders to force her toward the cleaning supplies. But Zara had been preparing for this moment her entire life, training in environments where hesitation could mean the difference between safety and danger. The first move was simple, a step to the side that put Zara out of Chelsea's immediate reach while positioning her closer to the exit. Chelsea, surprised by the evasion, stumbled slightly on the wet floor, her expensive shoes providing less traction than she had expected. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Chelsea warned, recovering her balance and moving forward again. This time, Zara was ready. When Chelsea lunged, Zara ducked low and pivoted, using Chelsea's momentum against her. The larger girl's forward motion carried her past her target and directly into one of the bathroom stalls, where she collided with the metal partition hard. Enough to leave a dent. Madison's eyes widened with something that might have been respect if it hadn't been overwhelmed by rage. "You little," but Zara was already moving. Years of martial arts training with her father, combined with the street awareness that came from growing up in neighborhoods where survival required constant vigilance, had prepared her for exactly this kind of confrontation. She grabbed the toilet brush that Chelsea had dropped and held it like a weapon, her stance balanced and ready. "Tiffany, stop recording and help us," Madison commanded, but Tiffany was frozen, her phone forgotten in her hand as she stared at Chelsea, who was still trying to extract herself from the bathroom stall. Madison reached into her designer bag and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray, the kind that wealthy parents bought for their daughters' protection at boarding school. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are when you can't see." But Zara had noticed the pepper spray when Madison first reached for her bag, and she was already moving when Madison's finger found the trigger. The stream of chemicals shot through the space where Zara had been standing, hitting the bathroom mirror instead and filling the air with a toxic cloud that made everyone's eyes water in the confusion that followed, with Madison temporarily blinded by her own weapon and Chelsea still struggling to regain her footing. Zara made her move toward the door. But Tiffany, perhaps motivated by panic or loyalty, stepped into her path. "You're not going anywhere," Tiffany said, her voice shaking but determined. Zara looked at the girl who had documented so many of her humiliations, who had turned her pain into entertainment for others, who had willingly participated in months of psychological torture. The rage that she had been suppressing for so long finally found its voice. "Get out of my way. Make me." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Tiffany had never been in a real fight, had never faced someone who was genuinely angry rather than merely frustrated. When she raised her hands to push Zara back, she left herself completely open. Zara's response was swift and precise. A palm strike to the solar plexus that left Tiffany gasping and doubled over, followed by a sweep that sent her to the floor. Beside her phone, which skittered across the wet tiles like a hockey puck, Madison, her eyes streaming from the pepper spray she had accidentally inhaled, fumbled for her bag again. "You're going to pay for this. My father will have you expelled. He'll have you arrested." He'll what?" Zara interrupted, her voice carrying a calm that was more terrifying than any shout. "He'll admit that his daughter tried to force a scholarship student to clean toilets. He'll explain why 3 of you cornered one of me in a basement bathroom. He'll show everyone the video that Tiffany was making." She picked up Tiffany's phone from where it had fallen, noting that the recording was still running. The entire confrontation had been captured, from Madison's initial threats to the pepper spray attack to the final moments of the fight. "You know what, Madison? You're right about one thing. This is going to be educational for everyone." Zara slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward the door, stepping over Chelsea, who was still sitting on the bathroom floor, holding her head. "You can't take that," Madison gasped, reaching out weakly. Zara paused at the door and looked back at the 3 girls who had made her life miserable for months. Madison was still partially blinded, her perfect makeup streaked with tears and chemical burns. Chelsea was sporting what would probably become a spectacular bruise on her forehead. Tiffany was curled up on the floor, still struggling to breathe normally. "Watch me," Zara said, and walked out of the bathroom, leaving behind the cleaning supplies and the 3 girls who had thought they could break her spirit with toilet brushes and humiliation. The game had changed completely. And for the first time since arriving at Westbrook Preparatory, Zara Williams held all the cards. Within 20 minutes of Zara walking out of that basement bathroom, the Westbrook Preparatory damage control machine had already sprung into action. Madison Hartwell, her eyes still red from pepper spray, but her survival instincts fully intact, had made 3 phone calls before even attempting to clean the chemical residue from her face. The first was to her father's personal assistant, the second to the family's crisis management consultant, and the third to Headmaster Samuel Whitmore's private cell phone. Headmaster Whitmore was in his office reviewing budget projections when his phone buzzed with the name that could make or break his career. Richard Hartwell didn't just sit on Westbrook's board of trustees. He was the board's largest individual donor, contributing over $2 million annually to the school's endowment. When Richard Hartwell called, Samuel Whitmore answered, regardless of the circumstances. "Samuel, we have a situation," came the familiar voice through the phone, carrying the kind of controlled urgency that billionaires used when their carefully constructed worlds showed signs of cracking. "My daughter has been assaulted by one of your scholarship students. I need this handled immediately and quietly." Whitmore felt his stomach drop. Scholarship students were always a liability, their very presence at Westbrook a constant reminder that the school's meritocracy narrative required occasional acknowledgement of actual merit. But they were necessary for tax purposes and public relations, carefully selected and closely monitored to ensure they enhanced rather than threatened the institution's reputation. "Of course, Richard. I'll investigate immediately." What exactly happened? Madison was using the restroom when this girl attacked her without provocation. "My daughter is traumatized, Samuel. She's talking about transferring schools, and frankly, I can't blame her. If Westbrook can't protect its students from violence, perhaps our family's philanthropic efforts would be better directed elsewhere." The threat was delivered with the casual precision of someone accustomed to using economic leverage as a weapon. Whitmore understood immediately that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about the fundamental power structure that kept Westbrook functioning as an elite institution rather than just another expensive private school. "I understand completely, Richard. Rest assured, this will be handled with the discretion and severity the situation demands. The student in question will face immediate consequences." As Whitmore hung up the phone, his assistant knocked on the door with the kind of urgency that indicated bad news was traveling fast. "Sir, there's been an incident in the basement restroom. 3 students are in the nurse's office, and there are conflicting reports about what happened." The nurse's office had been transformed into a triage center for damaged reputations rather than physical injuries. Madison sat on the examination table with ice packs pressed to her eyes, while Chelsea held a cold compress against the growing bruise on her forehead. Tiffany remained curled in a chair, still struggling with the aftermath of having the wind knocked out of her both literally and metaphorically. Dr. Patricia Morse, the school nurse, had been at Westbrook long enough to recognize the difference between actual medical emergencies and political crises disguised as health issues. The girls' injuries were minor, some chemical irritation, a bump on the head and bruised pride, but the implications were potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. "Tell me exactly what happened," Whitmore said as he entered the nurse's office, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing crises at elite institutions. Madison's story was a masterpiece of selective editing and strategic omissions. According to her version of events, she and her friends had been in the bathroom when Zara entered, acting aggressively. When they tried to calm her down, she had exploded into violence, attacking them with cleaning supplies and pepper spray. The racism, the forced toilet cleaning, the months of systematic harassment, none of that appeared in Madison's carefully crafted narrative. "She just started hitting us," Madison said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine trauma, but was actually a carefully calculated performance. "We tried to defend ourselves, but she was like an animal. I've never seen anything like it." Chelsea nodded vigorously, her own injuries lending credibility to the story. She seemed to know exactly what she was doing, like she had planned it, like she wanted to hurt us. Tiffany remained silent, still clutching her stomach where Zara's palm strike had connected. Her phone, which contained the video evidence that could expose the truth, was missing, taken by Zara during their confrontation. Whitmore listened to their account with the kind of practiced attention that administrators developed when dealing with wealthy families and sensitive situations. He asked follow-up questions designed to establish a clear narrative that would protect the school's interests while satisfying the demands for justice that were undoubtedly coming from powerful parents. "This is obviously a serious matter," Whitmore said finally. "Violence of any kind is completely unacceptable at Westbrook. I want you girls to go home for the rest of the day, and I'll personally ensure that appropriate disciplinary action is taken." As the 3 girls were escorted from the nurse's office by their family's personal assistants, Whitmore was already formulating his strategy. The first priority was containing the narrative before it could spread beyond the immediate participants. The second was gathering enough evidence to support the official version of events. The third was ensuring that any consequences fell on the person least capable of fighting back. The summons to Zara came during her advanced placement physics class, delivered by a student aide who seemed nervous about interrupting Dr. Peterson's lecture on electromagnetic radiation. "Zara Williams, you're needed in the headmaster's office immediately." The walk through Westbrook's halls felt different now, charged with the kind of electric tension that preceded thunderstorms. Students who normally ignored Zara's existence now stared openly, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly when she passed. Word of the bathroom incident had spread through the school's informal communication networks with the speed that only scandals could achieve. Whitmore's office was a temple to institutional power, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished alumni and photographs of the headmaster shaking hands with senators, Supreme Court justices, and Fortune 500 CEOs. The message was clear. This was a place where important people made important decisions, and those decisions had consequences that extended far beyond the school's ivy-covered walls. "Sit down, Miss Williams," Whitmore said, gesturing toward a chair that had been positioned to face his imposing desk. The setup was designed to reinforce the power dynamic, with Zara looking up at an authority figure whose position was backed by generations of wealth and influence. I've received some very disturbing reports about an incident that occurred earlier today, Whitmore began, his voice carrying the kind of disappointed tone that administrators used when they had already decided on guilt and were simply going through the motions of due process. Zara remained silent, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. She had learned from her mother's experiences with hostile supervisors that sometimes the best strategy was to let the other person reveal their intentions before committing to any particular response. 3 students have accused you of unprovoked assault in the basement restroom. They claim you attacked them with cleaning supplies and pepper spray, causing injuries that required medical attention. This is obviously a very serious matter, is it? Zara asked quietly. Whitmore blinked, clearly not expecting such a response. Excuse me, I asked if it's serious. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've already decided what happened without bothering to ask for my side of the story. Headmaster's jaw tightened. In his experience, scholarship students understood their precarious position and responded to authority with appropriate deference. Zara's calm confidence was both unexpected and unsettling. Very well, Whitmore said, leaning back in his chair. Tell me your version of events. Zara's account was precise and factual, delivered without emotion or embellishment. She described months of harassment, the systematic campaign of intimidation, and the bathroom incident that had been designed to humiliate her into dropping out. She explained how she had been cornered, threatened, and attacked, and how she had defended herself when faced with violence. That's quite a story, Whitmore said when she finished. Do you have any evidence to support these claims? Zara reached into her pocket and pulled out Tiffany's phone, placing it on the desk between them. Actually, I do. The color drained from Whitmore's face as he stared at the device. If Zara was telling the truth, if there was video evidence of what had really happened, then the carefully constructed narrative that protected Madison and her family would collapse completely. That phone doesn't belong to you, Whitmore said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. It was used to record me without my consent in a situation where I was being threatened and assaulted. I think that makes it evidence of a crime, don't you? Whitmore reached for the phone, but Zara was faster, snatching it back and returning it to her pocket. I don't think so. This is going to the police, along with a formal complaint about the harassment I've been experiencing. Miss Williams, I think you're overreacting. Sometimes misunderstandings occur between students, but that doesn't mean misunderstandings. Zara's voice carried an edge that made Whitmore flinch. They tried to force me to clean toilets while calling me for a charity case and help. They recorded it for entertainment. They attacked me with pepper spray when I refused to comply. Which part of that sounds like a misunderstanding to you? The headmaster realized that his usual strategies weren't working. Zara wasn't responding to authority the way scholarship students were supposed to. She wasn't grateful for the opportunity to attend Westbrook, wasn't willing to accept whatever punishment would preserve the institution's reputation, wasn't intimidated by the power structures that had always protected families like the Hartwells. Perhaps we can find a solution that works for everyone, Whitmore said, switching to a more conciliatory tone. Westbrook values all of its students, including our scholarship recipients. If there have been misunderstandings or conflicts, we can address them through counseling and mediation rather than involving outside authorities. What kind of solution? Well, given the serious nature of the allegations against you, suspension would normally be automatic. But if you were willing to acknowledge that the situation got out of hand, if you were willing to apologize to the other students involved, we might be able to find a more constructive approach. Zara stared at him with the kind of disbelief reserved for moments when reality exceeded even the most cynical expectations. You want me to apologize to them? Sometimes taking responsibility for our actions, even when we feel justified, can be a sign of maturity and growth. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. 3 students corner me in a bathroom, try to force me to clean toilets while filming it for humiliation, attack me with pepper spray when I refuse, and you want me to apologize for defending myself. Whitmore's silence was answer enough. And if I don't apologize, if I don't agree to pretend that being racist and forcing someone to clean toilets is just a misunderstanding, then what happens? Miss Williams, I think you're being unnecessarily combative. Westbrook has a zero-tolerance policy for violence, and the injuries sustained by other students are well documented. If you're unwilling to work within our disciplinary framework, then more serious consequences may be unavoidable. More serious consequences like expulsion? Like whatever consequences are appropriate for someone who assaults 3 fellow students without provocation. Zara stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Headmaster Whitmore, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. I have video evidence of everything that happened in that bathroom. I have documentation of months of harassment that you and your faculty have ignored. I have records of every incident, every threat, every time your precious students tried to destroy my life for the crime of being here on merit instead of money. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk out of this office, and I'm going to take this evidence to people who actually care about justice instead of protecting rich kids from the consequences of their actions. And when they ask me why the school's administration tried to cover this up, I'm going to tell them exactly what you just told me. Whitmore's face had gone pale. Miss Williams, I think you're making a serious mistake. The Hartwell family has significant influence in this community, and accusing their daughter of what? Racism? Assault? Trying to force a black student to clean toilets while filming it? Because that's exactly what I'm accusing her of, and I have proof. Zara walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Oh, and Headmaster? When this all comes out, and it will come out, make sure everyone knows that you had a chance to do the right thing. Make sure they know that when presented with evidence of racist harassment and assault, your first instinct was to protect the perpetrators and punish the victim. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a man whose career had just been irrevocably altered by a 17-year-old girl with a smartphone and an unshakable sense of justice. The cover-up attempt had failed before it even began, and now Samuel Whitmore had to face the reality that some storms were too powerful to be weathered through the usual channels of wealth and influence. Zara Williams was about to become a problem that money couldn't solve and connections couldn't contain. Detective Maria Santos had seen enough police reports from elite private schools to recognize the pattern immediately. Wealthy kids got into trouble, parents made phone calls, and somehow the trouble disappeared into a maze of administrative procedures and confidential settlements. But when 17-year-old Zara Williams walked into the Fairfield County Police Department that Tuesday afternoon with a smartphone full of evidence, Detective Santos knew this case would be different. I need to report an assault and harassment, Zara said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to unleash. And I need to report a conspiracy to cover it up. Santos had been a detective for 15 years, long enough to spot the difference between teenage drama and genuine criminal behavior. As she watched the video that Tiffany had recorded, her expression hardened with each passing second. The audio was crystal clear. Madison's threats, the racial overtones, the attempt to force Zara into degrading labor while being filmed for entertainment. This is felony assault and harassment with hate crime enhancements, Santos said, pausing the video at the moment when Madison raised the pepper spray. The filming component adds charges related to exploitation and intimidation. Who else has seen this? Nobody yet, Zara replied. But I made several backup copies before coming here. Santos nodded approvingly. Smart kid. We're going to need detailed statements about everything leading up to this incident. I want dates, witnesses, documentation of prior harassment. This looks like a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. While Zara provided her statement to Detective Santos, her mother Denise was making phone calls of her own. The first was to her cousin Jerome, who worked as an investigative journalist for the Hartford Courant. The second was to attorney Patricia Coleman, a civil rights lawyer who had built her career fighting discrimination in educational institutions. The third was to Reverend Michael Davis, whose church had a history of organizing community responses to racial injustice. By Wednesday morning, the story had begun to take shape in ways that the Hartwell family's crisis management team hadn't anticipated. Jerome Williams' initial article, titled "Elite Connecticut School Under Investigation for Racist Harassment," appeared on the Courant's website at 6 a.m., complete with carefully selected details that painted a devastating picture of institutional corruption and student victimization. The article didn't identify Zara by name, referring to her only as a scholarship student of color, but it provided enough context to make the story compelling without compromising her privacy. More importantly, it established a narrative framework that positioned the incident within the broader context of systemic racism in elite educational institutions. Attorney Coleman's press conference was scheduled for noon, giving the story time to percolate through social media and traditional news outlets. By 11 a.m., the hashtag toilet cleaning scandal was trending on Twitter, with thousands of users sharing their own experiences of racism and discrimination at elite schools. The story had touched a nerve that went far beyond one incident at one school. Richard Hartwell's morning began with a phone call from his publicist, whose voice carried the kind of panic usually reserved for natural disasters and stock market crashes. "Richard, we have a problem. A big one. The story is everywhere, and it's getting worse by the hour." Hartwell had built his fortune by staying ahead of market trends and managing risk with mathematical precision. But public relations crises involving his family's reputation required different skills, particularly when the allegations involved racism and assault. The usual tools, donations, connections, legal pressure were less effective when the story captured public attention and moral outrage. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Hartwell asked, already knowing the answer would be bad news. Video evidence of Madison and her friends trying to force a black student to clean toilets while calling her degrading names. The student fought back, and now there are criminal charges pending. The police are treating it as a hate crime. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Hartwell to understand that his family's carefully constructed public image was about to face its first genuine crisis. Madison had been groomed for a life of privilege and responsibility, but she had never learned the fundamental rule of elite behavior: never leave evidence. Westbrook Preparatory's Board of Trustees convened an emergency meeting at 10 a.m., their usual confidence replaced by the kind of grim determination that accompanies survival mode. The school's reputation had taken hits before: financial scandals, academic cheating, the occasional drug arrest, but nothing that threatened the fundamental legitimacy of the institution itself. Board Chairman William Ashford, Tiffany's grandfather and a man whose influence extended from Wall Street to Washington, called the meeting to order with uncharacteristic brevity. "Gentlemen, ladies, we have a situation that requires immediate and decisive action. Our legal counsel will brief us on the current status." Attorney Margaret Reed, whose law firm specialized in crisis management for elite institutions, had spent the morning reviewing video evidence and calculating potential damages. Her assessment was bleak but realistic. The school faced criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, federal oversight, and the kind of public scrutiny that could destroy decades of carefully cultivated prestige. "The video evidence is unambiguous," Reed reported. 3 students attempted to force another student to perform janitorial work while using racially charged language and filming the encounter. When the victim refused and defended herself, they attacked her with pepper spray. The administration then attempted to blame the victim and cover up the incident. Board member Senator Patricia Blackwood, whose political career depended on maintaining her reputation as a defender of civil rights, understood the implications immediately. This isn't just a school problem. This is a national story waiting to explode. If we don't get ahead of it, we're all going to be collateral damage. The emergency faculty meeting that followed was equally sobering. Teachers who had spent their careers at elite institutions suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that their complicity in maintaining discriminatory systems might have legal consequences. Professor Sterling, who had participated in the subtle harassment campaign against Zara, was already consulting with his union representative about potential criminal liability. Ms. Coleman, Zara's former ally in the history department, felt the weight of her own moral compromises as she listened to the administration's damage control strategy. She had witnessed the harassment, had known about the systematic exclusion, had chosen silence over solidarity. Now she faced a choice between continued complicity and public redemption. The media circus began in earnest, with Attorney Coleman's noon press conference, broadcast live on local television and streamed simultaneously on multiple social media platforms. Coleman was a veteran of high-profile civil rights cases, her silver hair and authoritative presence lending gravitas to accusations that might otherwise be dismissed as teenage drama. Today we're announcing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Westbrook Preparatory Academy and several individual defendants. Coleman began, her voice carrying the kind of moral authority that made journalists reach for their notebooks. The evidence will show a pattern of racist harassment, assault, and institutional cover-up that shocks the conscience. The video evidence, edited to protect Zara's identity while preserving the most damaging audio, was released during the press conference. Madison's voice, clear and unmistakable, demanding that Zara clean toilets while calling her charity case and help, became the sound bite that defined the story for millions of viewers. Social media reaction was swift and merciless. The video was shared thousands of times within the first hour, with comments ranging from outrage to disgust to calls for criminal prosecution. Celebrity activists picked up the story, politicians issued statements, and advocacy organizations began organizing protests outside Westbrook's gates. The hashtag privileged brats began trending alongside hashtag toilet cleaning scandal, with users sharing their own stories of encountering entitled behavior from wealthy students. The narrative had evolved beyond one incident to encompass broader questions about inequality, racism, and the role of elite institutions in perpetuating systemic discrimination. Madison Hartwell's social media accounts, which had previously showcased her privileged lifestyle to thousands of followers, became battlegrounds of public opinion. Comment sections filled with angry responses. Her Instagram photos were screenshot and mocked, and her family's business interests faced boycott threats from outraged consumers. By 3 p.m., protesters had gathered outside Westbrook's gates, their signs reading "Justice for Zara" and "No More Racist Schools." Local news crews broadcast live from the scene, interviewing parents, students, and community members about their reactions to the scandal. The peaceful demonstration grew throughout the afternoon, eventually including clergy members, civil rights activists, and politicians seeking to associate themselves with the cause of justice. Headmaster Whitmore watched the protests from his office window, understanding that his career at Westbrook was effectively over. The board would need a scapegoat, someone to blame for the institutional failures that had led to this crisis. His attempted cover-up of the incident made him the obvious choice for sacrifice. The district attorney's office issued a statement at 4 p.m., announcing that criminal charges were being filed against Madison Hartwell, Chelsea Blackwood, and Tiffany Ashford. The charges included assault, harassment, conspiracy, and hate crime enhancements that could result in significant jail time for all 3 defendants. "Let me be clear," District Attorney Robert Chun told the assembled media. "Wealth and privilege do not place anyone above the law. The evidence in this case demonstrates criminal behavior that will be prosecuted to the full extent of our authority." The Connecticut State Department of Education announced its own investigation into Westbrook's compliance with anti-discrimination laws, with potential sanctions including loss of accreditation and state funding. Federal agencies indicated they were reviewing the case for possible civil rights violations that could trigger more severe penalties. As evening approached, the story had spread beyond Connecticut to national news outlets. Cable news programs featured panels discussing the broader implications of the case, with commentators drawing connections to systemic racism, educational inequality, and the behavior of privileged youth. The incident had become a symbol of larger social problems that resonated with audiences across the country. Richard Hartwell's evening was spent in meetings with his legal team, his publicist, and a crisis management consultant who specialized in reputation repair for wealthy families. The advice was unanimous: distance Madison from the family's business interests, issue a public apology that accepted responsibility without admitting legal liability, and prepare for a protracted legal battle that would cost millions of dollars and decades of reputation building. "The video is devastating," the crisis consultant explained. "Your daughter's voice, her words, her actions, they're all indefensible from a public relations perspective. The best we can do is minimize the damage and hope the news cycle moves on to other stories." But Hartwell knew that some stories don't fade away. Some stories become touchstones for broader social movements, symbols of injustice that people remember for generations. His daughter's voice, demanding that a black student clean toilets while being filmed for entertainment, might become one of those moments that define an era. As night fell over Fairfield County, Zara Williams sat in her family's modest apartment, watching news coverage of the story she had unleashed. The scared, isolated scholarship student who had walked into that basement bathroom was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power and wasn't afraid to use it. The truth was out, spreading faster than any attempt to contain it. The privileged world of Westbrook Preparatory had been exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, and nothing would ever be the same again. The storm Zara had created was just beginning, and its effects would reshape not just one school, but the entire conversation about racism, privilege, and justice in America's elite institutions. 6 months after the basement bathroom incident that shook Westbrook Preparatory to its foundations, Zara Williams stood before a congressional subcommittee on education and civil rights, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systemic change. The marble halls of the Rayburn House office building felt different from Westbrook's corridors. Here, power served democracy rather than perpetuating privilege. "Honorable members of Congress," Zara began, her testimony broadcast live on C-SPAN and streaming to millions of viewers worldwide. The incident at Westbrook wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of systems designed to maintain inequality while appearing fair. Today, I want to talk about how we can do better. The transformation had begun within days of the video's release. Madison Hartwell, Chelsea Blackwood, and Tiffany Ashford had been arrested on felony charges, their perp walks broadcast on every major news network. The sight of 3 privileged teenagers in handcuffs had become an iconic image, representing the possibility that wealth and status couldn't always purchase immunity from consequences. Madison's trial had been a media sensation, with court proceedings live-streamed and analyzed by legal experts who marveled at the prosecution's ironclad case. The video evidence left no room for doubt or alternative interpretations. Madison's own voice, demanding that Zara clean toilets while using racially charged language, had convicted her more effectively than any prosecutor's argument. The jury's Guilty verdict on all counts: assault, harassment, conspiracy, and hate crimes had taken less than 3 hours to reach. Madison was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention, followed by 5 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service at organizations serving underprivileged youth. Chelsea and Tiffany received similar sentences, their futures forever altered by 30 minutes of cruelty captured on video. But the legal consequences were just the beginning. The civil lawsuit that attorney Coleman had filed against Westbrook Preparatory had resulted in a $50 million settlement, the largest civil rights payout in Connecticut's history. More importantly, the settlement included binding agreements that transformed how the school operated. From admissions policies to disciplinary procedures to faculty training programs, Headmaster Samuel Whitmore had resigned in disgrace. His career in education effectively ended by his attempt to cover up the incident. His replacement, Dr. Aisha Johnson, was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in civil rights enforcement. Her mandate was clear: transform Westbrook from a symbol of privilege into a model of inclusive excellence. The Board of Trustees had been completely restructured, with half the positions now filled by community representatives, civil rights advocates, and education reform experts. The Hartwell, Blackwood, and Ashford families had been forced to resign their positions and forfeit their naming rights to various school buildings and programs. Richard Hartwell's business empire had suffered devastating losses as investors fled and partners severed relationships. The family's construction company had lost major contracts. Their charitable foundation had been disbanded amid questions about tax fraud, and their social standing in Connecticut's elite circles had evaporated overnight. Madison's actions had cost her family an estimated $200 million in lost business and legal fees. The ripple effects extended far beyond Westbrook's campus. The Connecticut state legislature had passed the Zara Williams Act, requiring all private schools receiving tax benefits to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and submit to regular federal oversight. Similar legislation was being considered in 12 other states, each bill named in honor of the teenager who had refused to clean toilets for the entertainment of her tormentors. Elite schools across the country scrambled to review their own policies and practices, terrified of becoming the next Westbrook. The case had created a new legal precedent that made institutional complicity in harassment subject to both criminal prosecution and civil liability. Insurance companies began requiring anti-discrimination training as a condition of coverage, and accreditation boards implemented new standards for investigating bias complaints. Zara's return to Westbrook in January had been triumphant in ways she had never imagined. The same students who had once whispered about her scholarship status now looked at her with something approaching awe. She had single-handedly brought down the most powerful families in the school's history and forced an entire institution to confront its foundational inequities. The changes at Westbrook were visible immediately. The scholarship program had been expanded to ensure that 40% of students came from low-income families, with full support for uniforms, textbooks, and extracurricular activities. The curriculum had been revised to include mandatory courses on social justice, systemic inequality, and the history of civil rights in America. The faculty underwent monthly training on unconscious bias and cultural competency. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, the social dynamics had shifted dramatically. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined student interactions had been shattered by the understanding that actions had consequences, regardless of family wealth or social status. Students who had once felt empowered to exclude and harass now found themselves subject to intense scrutiny and potential expulsion for discriminatory behavior. Zara's own transformation was equally remarkable. The quiet, careful girl who had once navigated Westbrook's halls with her head down had evolved into a confident advocate who spoke at conferences, consulted with policymakers, and inspired countless other students facing similar challenges. Her experience had given her a platform and a purpose that extended far beyond her own education. The scholarship fund established in her honor had already raised over $10 million, providing full educational support for students from underrepresented communities at elite schools across New England. The Zara Williams Foundation, run by her mother Denise, offered legal assistance to students facing discrimination and harassment at educational institutions. Marcus Chun, one of the few scholarship students who had supported Zara throughout her ordeal, had become her closest friend and partner in advocacy work. Together, they had created a peer support network that connected scholarship students across different schools, sharing resources and strategies for navigating elite academic environments. Isabella Rodriguez, whose family had immigrated from Mexico, found her voice in the aftermath of Zara's victory. She began organizing students around immigration issues and educational equity, understanding that Zara's courage had created space for others to challenge different forms of institutional bias. Even some of the wealthy students had been transformed by the experience. Several had come forward to apologize for their complicity in the harassment campaign, acknowledging that their silence had enabled Madison's cruelty. A few had used their family resources to support the scholarship fund and volunteer with community organizations, genuinely seeking to understand their privilege and use it constructively. Professor Coleman, who had witnessed Zara's harassment without intervening, had undergone her own reckoning. She resigned from Westbrook and accepted a position at a public school in Bridgeport, where she worked with students who faced the same challenges Zara had overcome. Her guilt over her inaction had motivated her to become a more active advocate for educational equity. The media attention had brought opportunities that Zara had never imagined. Publishers competed to acquire the rights to her story, with the advance from her memoir funding college scholarships for dozens of other students. Hollywood studios expressed interest in adapting her experience into a film, though Zara remained skeptical about whether the entertainment industry could tell her story with the nuance it deserved. Universities that had once seemed impossibly out of reach now actively recruited her, understanding that her presence would enhance their own reputations while demonstrating their commitment to diversity and social justice. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and MIT had all offered full scholarships, along with promises of research opportunities and advocacy platforms. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her own community. The hair salon where she had worked was now bustling with customers who wanted to support the family of the girl who had stood up to racist bullies. Her mother had been able to reduce her hours at the hospital, spending more time with her daughter and pursuing her own education through the scholarship program they had established. The basement bathroom where everything had changed had been converted into a meditation and reflection space, with a plaque commemorating Zara's courage and the importance of standing up to injustice. Students now gathered there to discuss social issues and plan community service projects, transforming a site of intended humiliation into a symbol of empowerment. As Zara prepared for her graduation from Westbrook as valedictorian, with acceptances to every college she had applied to, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared, isolated girl who had been cornered in that bathroom had found strength she didn't know she possessed, courage that had inspired a movement, and a voice that had changed laws. The graduation ceremony itself was a celebration of transformation. Zara's speech, delivered to an audience that included civil rights leaders, politicians, and journalists, focused not on her own achievements, but on the work that remained to be done. She challenged her classmates to use their privilege constructively, to fight injustice wherever they encountered it, and to remember that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. 6 months ago, 3 students tried to force me to clean toilets while filming it for their entertainment, Zara said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. They thought they were teaching me about my place in their world. Instead, they taught me about my power to change that world. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes, but Zara was already thinking about the future. She had accepted Harvard's offer, planning to study law and public policy with the goal of expanding civil rights protections in educational institutions. Her experience at Westbrook had shown her both the depths of institutional racism and the possibility of transformation when people refused to accept injustice. Attorney Coleman, now serving as Zara's mentor and friend, had helped her establish a legal clinic that would provide free representation to students facing discrimination. The clinic would be based in Harvard Law School, but would serve students across the country, using Zara's story as a template for challenging institutional bias through the courts. The ripple effects of that December afternoon in a basement bathroom continued to spread, inspiring students at other elite schools to document and report harassment, encouraging parents to demand accountability from educational institutions, and showing lawmakers the urgent need for stronger civil rights protections. In private schools. Madison Hartwell, now serving her sentence at a juvenile facility in Hartford, had become a reluctant symbol of the consequences of privilege unchecked by empathy or morality. Her fall from grace had been swift and complete, but some observers noted signs of genuine remorse and personal growth during her incarceration. Whether she would emerge as a reformed advocate for justice or remain bitter about her lost privilege remained to be seen. As Zara packed her belongings for the move to Harvard, she found the crumpled note that had been left in her locker months earlier, the one telling her to remember her place. She had kept it as a reminder of how far she had traveled, both literally and metaphorically. Her place, she now understood, was wherever she chose to stand and fight for justice. The girl who had once walked alone to the bus stop now traveled with security details to speaking engagements across the country. The student who had eaten lunch in isolation now dined with senators and Supreme Court justices who sought her input on civil rights legislation. The teenager who had been told she didn't belong now belonged everywhere she went, because she had learned that belonging wasn't something that could be granted or denied by others. It was something she claimed for herself. Zara Williams had entered Westbrook Preparatory as a scholarship student seeking an education. She was leaving as a civil rights leader who had educated an entire nation about the persistence of racism and the power of courage. The bathroom incident that was meant to break her spirit had instead revealed her strength, and that strength had become a beacon of hope for countless others facing their own battles against injustice. The dawn of a new era in American education had begun, and Zara Williams stood at its center, no longer the victim of other people's cruelty, but the architect of her own destiny and a champion for all those who would follow in her footsteps. The fight was far from over, but the foundation for lasting change had been laid, one courageous moment at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.